the term is exactly what it says it is, and that is when two people are sexually involved and one becomes violent either physically, psychologically, or emotionally toward the other, or they become violent toward each other. It can be mutual.
Well, when you say physically, emotionally, and the spirit, all that kind of stuff, isn't that what we used to call spousal abuse?
Yes, because it is all abusive. But one of the things that has not been well understood, I think, is what is driving the violence or the abuse. And what researchers have found actually drives it is the desire of each partner to know that the other loves them as much as they love the other. If I'm not sure whether my partner loves me as much as I love him or her, then what sets in is something called primal panic.
Panic?
And primal panic, yes. And that is a deep, acute fear that we are going to lose connection with the other. And when that happens, it sometimes gets expressed as violence, but the violence is more a way of trying to say, don't you get it? I need you. Something like that. Now there's a kind of a long road between the desire for the love and the action of some form of violent enactment.
Interesting here to me is the fact that the police were very in tune with the fact that this is a reality going on in our society, and particularly that they noticed an upsurge at times like Christmas and other holiday times, and that they raised the issue. And I look at that thinking intimate partner violence doesn't usually make the news unless it ends in a death. And, of course, that's what we've had. We had a few of them, in fact, in Nova Scotia. And if I remember correctly, 7 people have died in the last while at the hands of an abusive or violent partner. And, of course, one would be enough to be concerned and worried and upset. But 7, that becomes, more of a great concern about society itself. And one wonders then, what if... That to me sounds like the tip of the iceberg when somebody actually dies at the hands of a violent partner. And I suspect there's a whole lot more other lesser abuse that's taking place, and perhaps over a very long time, before we find out at such a crisis.
Exactly. Yes, over a long period of time. And it's generally rooted, in my experience, in a profound insecurity about being able to maintain the connection with the one that you love. This has a lot of complexity to it. Each individual partner struggles with a certain degree of insecurity, and together they can trigger that insecurity in each other, or one more triggering than the other one. But it's I'm sort of finding myself getting into the weeds here because this is very complex. But one of the things about Christmas, and Christmas is the biggest one, because we have all these expectations, and they are fueled by television ads and radio ads and print ads, all sorts of things, that finally we're going to have the happy reunion with the family that we've always longed for, and everybody's going to love one another, and it's the most beautiful time of the year, as the song says, and all that kind of thing. And then, somebody gets drunk and they make a nasty remark to somebody else, and a fight starts, and all kinds of things go on, and it turns out to be miserable. So therapists are terribly busy at two different times in the year. One is Christmas, after Christmas, and the other is after Valentine's Day, because the expectations are so high. Maybe this year it will happen. Maybe this year it will be the perfect holiday. And people are people, and they do what they've been doing for years. And it isn't the perfect holiday.
It's interesting you say it that way, and I twig to the idea that Christmas is the big holiday. Certainly, it never occurred to me that Valentine's Day. I don't even think of it as a holiday. But you make the point. Valentine's Day has been drummed up as being the pinnacle of expressing love. And,
absolutely.
And what you're telling us is that love and violence seem to go hand in hand. Hence the intimate partner violence title. And it's the broken love. Is it something missing in the capacity to love that leads to this?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's the vulnerability. We're never so vulnerable as when we love. And that's actually a quote from Freud from 1930. But when we really love, the thing we want is to be loved just as much in return. And if we see a little crack in that love, it's scary. So it's actually love and fear that drive eventually the violence. I mean, think of any parent knows that when their 2-year-old wants something, they will state what they want, and then if they can't have it, they'll get upset and they'll cry, and maybe they'll go into a full-blown tantrum because they can't have what it is that they want. Now, it's, when you're 2, it's often something that's not vital to life, but you can feel how distressed their little nervous systems are. And we never lose the capacity to get to that level of distress. And in adult life, when it involves a partner, a person that we are in love with and want to be loved by, this feels like a life-saving thing. And in fact, we're finding out that neurologically we are wired to have that level of attachment, that it feels life-saving. That's where the term primal panic comes from, because it feels like life is ending if we are losing the love. It's really quite powerful.
Oh, no question. I always thought, frankly, that the term of time of life they called the terrible twos, I always thought those tantrums were a learned response. That is to say, the 2-year-old had already learned that if I don't get what I want, I throw a tantrum and they'll break down and give it to me.
Well, hopefully the 2-year-old finds out fairly quickly that that's not the case, because, so maybe 2 is a bad term, because there is a pattern of dysregulation at that age. You could say 1.5, you could say 3, you could say any number of ages, but you can feel how urgent it is in the way the child is crying.
Yeah, I was just conceding the fact that I always thought it was a learned response, that we as kids learn how to get our way. But you've made the point that it's inherent in us. It's a breakdown in the sense of our comfort zone, you might say, if I want to simplify it. A breakdown in the sense of being loved and protected even at a very, very early age. Another thing I want to address too is that over the years, I've been doing this for quite a long time, but we're making a sincere commitment to talk about mental health issues now on an ongoing basis, where before it would happen after a violent situation. And over the years, I can recall vividly talking to police, talking to therapists, and so on, and they would talk about how the man finally cracked and he committed whatever crime. And I always found myself saying, well, wait a minute now, it can't always be the man. But I recognize that men are more physical, and in that regard, their violence is more physical. But we had one of the 7 incidents here in Nova Scotia in the last while where the police arrested a woman. Now, that would be rare, I suspect. But yet,
No, it's not.
But it can be either or, can it not?
Yes, and it's not rare that the woman commits a violent act. It might be less frequent that she commits a physically violent act, but women are emotionally and psychologically violent toward their men, just as men are emotionally and psychologically violent toward their women. So this is not a gender-oriented process. This is equally applied to both men and women. But you don't hear about the women being physically violent toward their men, partly because men are somewhat reluctant to report it, so it doesn't get recorded. And that is changing. But often there is women are using the more the emotional and psychological sorts of techniques. So, no, when I worked at New Directions in Amherst, I was not only hearing about the men's experience, because I was working specifically with the men, but we knew that the women also were not only committing acts of some form of violence, but aware of it. They understood that they were doing things. So this is not a gender-linked experience.
Well, I appreciate that, certainly. And I want to go a step further and say it's not just 2 people quietly in a back room in a house somewhere. That these kinds of things, as you pointed out earlier, happen over a long period of time before it erupts in that violent conclusion that we hear about on the news, a violent conclusion that invariably involves the police. But rather, something's been going on for a long time, and I would argue that going back in time, I don't know how far, a generation, maybe 2, and when neighbors took care of neighbors and people knew there was something going wrong in a household, and somehow conversation over tea or dropping off a casserole or a pot of soup or something, there was a connection with community, a connection with society that helped. Am I crazy on that? Maybe that's the wrong word to use in this discussion. Am I wrong in that? Have we abdicated our responsibility as neighbors?
Well, I don't know if it's fair to say we've abdicated our responsibility, but certainly the more connected a person is in a community, the more potential support is available. And again, we're getting into a deeply complex issue here, but some of what fuels this is trauma, intergenerational or developmental trauma, and as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think we have to begin to understand the depth of and the breadth of the trauma in order to have some feel for how these things arise, because it is a long, long trajectory.
And again, during the introduction, I said you're going to be with us now on a regular basis to address different issues, and you invite questions and thoughts and concerns from our listeners as well. But
Yes.
this to me, I think, intimate partner violence represents the pinnacle of the breakdown, the pinnacle of failure of society and social services, the difficulty of only being introduced to the problem when it's the police, and the police aren't geared to handle it in the first place. So we're going to talk about all these kinds of things, but the Mass Casualty Commission, and you're familiar with that from the Portapic of the shooting spree, declared this not a crisis, but I lost the word. It just went through my head here.
Epidemic.
Epidemic, yes. And I challenged that recently. What do you mean epidemic? But I'm reassured by all parties that it truly is today an epidemic.
Yes, it certainly is.
Well, we'll talk about this and other things, and maybe I could ask you to, if I've overlooked any important point you'd like to make here for a last statement.
No, but I would like to let your listeners know that I will be doing a presentation about trauma, which it covers from symptoms to resolution, healing efforts to do that. And this will take place on Wednesday evening, February 19th at 6 o'clock at the Seniors Club in Oxford, which is at 31 Ellis Street. I have felt that this is something that people need to know about. They need to understand it. So I'm doing a series of presentations, just information sessions on trauma, so that people understand what it's about.